Now, this is breaking news from WCCO.
And it's good to be with you here on CBS News Minnesota. I'm Jason DeRusha along with Heather Brown, and we are following breaking news this morning in the George Floyd murder case.
Just this morning, former Minneapolis police officer Thomas Lane pleaded guilty to one state charge of aiding and abetting second-degree manslaughter in the killing of George Floyd.
Plea deal is what got us here. One count of aiding and abetting second-degree unintentional murder was dismissed. That's a charge that could carry up to 40 years in prison. Thomas Lane facing that state trial in June, along with the two other former officers that were there as Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd, Tu Tao and J. Alexander King. As of this moment, still proceeding towards a trial.
A state trial there, too. Right now, of course, we are joined by WCCO legal analyst Joe Tamburino. And Joe, why don't we just go through and explain what actually was agreed upon for this plea deal?
Well, this plea deal was basically this, that he would plead to the lesser charge of second-degree manslaughter and receive less of a sentence than what the guidelines call for. It's called a downward departure. The guidelines call for 48 months for a second-degree manslaughter. He is getting 36 months. That's basically a year more than Kim Potter.
And that 36 months, that would serve concurrently, so it served the same time as his federal sentence, which is still yet to be handed down.
That's correct. He's getting the benefit of not only a downward departure on a lesser charge, but also that the charges with federal court will be concurrent, which means they run together. You don't get extra time, as well as the fact that he will be able to serve his time in a federal prison, not state.
And that side of things is part of why we didn't see a sentence handed down yet in the federal case, right? Is it unusual, Joe, how kind of the federal prosecution seems so closely coordinated with the state prosecution here?
Yes, it is unusual because think of it this way. It's called dual sovereignties. You have a federal system and you have a state system. And the reason why you could get sentences in both of those sovereignties is because they are separate legally. And we've seen that in other cases. We've seen it going back to Rodney King, where the officers were acquitted in state court but convicted in federal. But in this case, we have a very close working relationship with both offices, which is very unusual.
Joe, we know the state trial for the three officers was scheduled to come up in June. Now it appears that we just got a message from the Attorney General's office that they will proceed with that state trial for the two officers now. But I'm wondering, why now? Why this plea deal now?
Well, plea deals aren't unusual in the sense that they happen all the time. But what makes this very unusual is that you're getting it basically within weeks before trial. There's already been a federal conviction, and the Attorney General's office is going down from a second-degree unintentional murder, which is a very serious case. It's a murder case. You would go away to prison for 150 months at least, down to a sentence of 36 months, which means he would only serve 2 years. It's less than if you were, say, drunk, driving, and killed a pedestrian. You'd get 4 years for that, and it's a completely negligence crime. So it is unusual, the timing and the nature of the plea.
In the federal court, Thomas Lane was convicted by a jury. Now, bearing in mind he was on his first formal week on the job. On video, Thomas Lane is the one that I think a lot of us looked at this as an outside observer and said, well, Thomas Lane did ask Derek Chauvin if they should roll him over. You know, a brand new officer. The federal jury said, well, yeah, you're a new officer, but you still have a legal duty to intervene and to render aid, and they didn't do either of those things. Do you think Keith Ellison's office looked at this and said, we're not sure we're going to be able to get that aiding and abetting murder conviction in this case because of the fact that Thomas Lane, I mean, none of these guys are sympathetic to a jury. We've seen that. But certainly when you say he at least asked if we should do something, he's the only one who even expressed any of that.
Yes, those are great points, because I think basically the Attorney General had to decide this. Look, Mr. Lane is in a position where he did tell Mr. Chauvin, I think we should turn over Mr. Floyd. So he was at least concerned about Mr. Floyd's welfare for some period of time. And what they thought probably is that there's a chance they could lose this trial next month, which means that they're going to offer a plea bargain. That happens sometimes. But in terms of a plea bargain where you go from second-degree unintentional murder, many years in prison, down to basically 2 years, that's very unusual.
Yeah. Was he just way overcharged? Is that? I mean, it's hard not to wonder if they were so quick to agree to this. Why was he charged with such a severe crime?
Jason, that's an excellent question. That's an excellent question, because in order to get a downward departure, to go from 48 months down to 36 months, you have to agree as a prosecutor that there are mitigating circumstances, that this case is unusual in the facts and the defendant deserves a break. If that's so, why were there such high charges to begin with? Why did we go through all of this over the last year plus?
Joe, obviously you weren't in on the negotiations and what was all decided there, but do you think that a deal was not offered to Tu Tao or J. Alexander King, but was to Thomas Lane?
That would be unlikely, only because of this. Usually in joint trials, if an offer is made, you make an offer to all parties. Now, we don't know if that was the case here. And even if they did make an offer, we don't know if they were treating the defendants individually, meaning did they make an offer to Mr. Tao as some number, to Mr. King as another number, and to Mr. Lane for 36 months. But usually in joint defense cases, yes, offers are made, and you try to be consistent with the numbers.
Talking with Joe Tamburino here about the breaking news that came out just before 9 this morning. Hearing that turned out to be a plea hearing involving Thomas Lane, one of the officers involved in the murder of George Floyd. Joe, when we step back and take maybe a broader look at this entire case, this is a case that I think, to a certain degree, the community feels like there never can really be justice for the life that was taken on that Memorial Day night. But now we have Derek Chauvin convicted of murder in state court, pled guilty to civil rights crimes in federal court. The 3 other officers who were standing by all found guilty in federal court, and now another state court guilty of plea. I mean, this is sort of remarkable in the history of Minnesota and law enforcement, and perhaps in the country.
Yes, it is remarkable. I mean, basically starting with Mohammed Noor's conviction and going forward, we have seen a shift in how the public reviews and decides cases like this when they're called to decide it as jurors. So you're right. It definitely is remarkable. We've seen all this just in a matter of a few years.
Joe, what does this mean now for the trial for the other 2 officers?
Good question. It means basically 2 things. Number one, it's going to be a shorter trial because you have 1 less defendant. I mean, the more defendants, the longer the trial takes. But number 2, it's going to affect the trial in the sense that the other officers will not have the benefit of Thomas Lane's words saying, please, maybe we should turn over Mr. Floyd. Now, Mr. Lane could testify. I mean, he's already pled guilty. He's already been convicted in federal court. But if he doesn't testify, there will be an issue as to whether or not those words get admitted into evidence.
Joe Tamburino, thank you for your insight here live on CBS News Minnesota. We appreciate it. Coming up right after this, WCCO's Esme Murphy with a special report right outside the courthouse where Thomas Lane pled guilty. She, the only reporter who was in the courthouse as this all happened, only TV reporter. Stay with us on CBS News Minnesota for continuing coverage of this case.